Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Bennet, Chief of Staff here at the National Endowment for the Arts, and I wanted to welcome you all to the Our Town Community Indicators Study presentation that we'll be making this afternoon. I have just a little bit of housekeeping I'd love to run through with you, and then I'll turn things over to Steve Shewfelt, the Deputy Director of our Office of Research and Analysis. All of your phones are muted, so none of you will be able to speak. You'll just be able to hear us. Steve is going to run through about a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation, might run to 25 minutes. And following that, we've left about a half hour for questions and answers. For the questions and answers, you'll see the Q&A box that some folks have already started typing in. You can type your questions into that box at any time. We'll save all of the questions and answer them at the end. At the end of the presentation, we'll also expand the question and answer box, so you'll be able to see what other people are asking and commenting on as well. And we will do our best to get to all of your questions. If that's not possible, we will save them all and incorporate them into our thinking and talking after the fact. You may see the raise your hand button on your interface on the screen. That's not a function we'll be using, so don't use that. And finally, this webinar will be posted on our website, an archive of it, in the podcast, webcast, and webinar section in a few days. So if you want to refer back to anything we've gone over or refer it to colleagues, you can do so. That's all the housekeeping we have, so let me turn things over to Steve Shewfelt from the Office of Research and Analysis.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks everybody for joining us here today. I'm going to talk today about a research project that's rooted in the Our Town Grant Program, one of the NEA's signatures programs. The Our Town Indicators Study is being designed and managed by the Office of Research and Analysis in close coordination with our design department, which manages the Our Town Grant Program itself. We're going to start the conversation today by going over a brief background of the origins and objectives of the Indicators Study, and then I'll talk about the steps we've taken so far toward achieving those objectives and lay out our plans for future progress. What you see here is a statement of our goals for the project. While you take a look at that, I'm going to say a few words about the why. Why is the NEA conducting the Our Town Indicators Study? As many of you know, Our Town is designed to support creative placemaking around the country. It's an innovative and important leadership initiative at the NEA and an exciting program with widespread support and visibility. The NEA is engaged in the Our Town Indicators Study because, given the energy behind the Our Town program, we wanted to make a comparable effort to ask how we're doing with the projects it funds. We want to improve our ability to understand how communities change when creative placemaking activities take root. And just as importantly, we want to share our findings and our system with the public and with local government officials so that they can address these issues in their own communities. In sum, we're engaging in an effort to build capacity around the country to data mine on behalf of the arts. Now, these are kind of lofty words. What do they really mean? Before getting into a more detailed explanation of this system, I want to take a moment to clarify what we mean in this context when we talk about indicators. An indicator is simply an observation about a place at a particular time. It can be quantitative or qualitative, and it's designed to, in this case, inform perceptions about community change. An indicator system refers to a grouping, or in some cases a combination of individual indicators, designed to give us a more complete picture of what's going on across time or in a group of communities. In this example from an indicator system, we're looking at a table showing the average wage of workers in different communities in Chicago. In the left column, you see a list of the neighborhoods of interest in this system. In the second column, you see the average wage in 2008 for each of these neighborhoods. These are the indicators. An indicator system may include provisions to track indicators across time. As we see in the third column, which shows how this indicator has changed from 2002 to 2008 in each community, we can call this comparing it to a baseline. Indicators can also be compared to a benchmark. In this case, presenting the average wage for the entire city of Chicago gives us a benchmark against which we can compare the average wage or the average wage change in individual communities. So this gives us a sense of what we mean when we're talking about designing an indicator system. I'd like to turn now to a discussion of the progress we've made to date. Our focus so far has been on developing the conceptual framework for this indicator system. As I described at the outset, our goal is to develop a system that will improve our ability to understand the impact of creative placemaking. We began this process by working closely with the design team to get a better handle on what creative placemaking means in the R-Town context. As we looked more closely at the R-Town projects, we found that they tended to hang together quite naturally into one of four categories or segments. The lines between these categories aren't bright. Some projects contain elements of more than one segment, but the process of doing this helped our thinking about what kinds of projects we expected to be associated with what kinds of outcomes. The four segments we identified, each illustrated with an example from our town, are shown in this slide. In the top left corner, we have cultural industry and district development projects, an example of which is the redevelopment plan for the town center in Ajo, Arizona. Artist incubation and support projects support artists by connecting them to work, space, or training. An example is the effort in Wilson, North Carolina to repair and conserve large-scale whirligigs created by Volus Simpson. An example of the third segment, art installations, festivals, and engagement, is the preparations for an exhibit about the evolution of Sarpy County, Nebraska, from agricultural to suburban and urban uses. And lastly, physical arts infrastructure includes projects like the design of a permanent home in a park in Marfa, Texas for the Drive-In, which is a new outdoor venue for music, film, and performing arts. The process of segmenting the creative placemaking activities focuses on the input side of the equation. Identifying the segments helped us think more systematically about what creative placemaking activities are in the R-Town context. However, as I alluded to at the outset, the focus of the indicator study is on the outcome side of the equation. We want to think just as systematically about ways to identify changes in the communities in which programs are implemented. At the broadest level, we want to focus our efforts on outcomes related to livability. Now, livability has different meanings in different contexts. Our goal in this project is to focus on dimensions of livability that are related to creative placemaking. At the conceptual level, we identified four key categories of impacts that we expect to see to different extents and different segments through the R-Town projects. I'm going to present these categories in the form of four hypotheses about the impact of creative placemaking. First hypothesis is that creative placemaking will have a positive effect on artists and the surrounding arts community. Secondly, we expect that residents' attachment to community will be increased by creative placemaking. Third, we expect that creative placemaking will improve the quality of life for neighborhood residents. And fourth, we think that local economic conditions, from household incomes to business and property values, will be positively affected by creative placemaking. Now, for each of these hypothesized impact areas, we want to develop a set of indicators that will help us follow changes in a community. There are many ways we could approach developing indicators for these kinds of neighborhood change. Some of you listening right now have developed your own approaches that work quite well in your localities. So to help narrow down the pool of candidate indicators, we identified a set of criteria by which we would decide whether a measure was appropriate for this system. First is that we don't want to create a new data collection mandate. We want to draw from existing sources, public or private, that we can access. Secondly, regarding sustainability, we recognize that many of the outcomes associated with creative placemaking are visible mostly over the long term. So we focus on indicators that reflect these long-term sustainable changes. Sustainability also refers to the idea that access to the data that feeds into the system has to be sustainable. We can't rely on indicators from localities that, for whatever their strengths may be, might not be available over the long term. Next, comprehensiveness and comparability refers to the idea that we need data for this system that is nationally accessible for large to small geographies and that's comparable across as widespread a geographic area as possible. Next, cost effectiveness refers to the fact that while we're not ruling out higher cost options, our desire for sustainability means that most measures are based on low cost, primarily public sources. And lastly, replicability. We want our approach to be easily understood and replicated by any number of organizations in the future. This last point has implications for how we present the information in the system. We need to be very transparent and clear about all the measures we use, their strengths, their weaknesses, how they're calculated, why we think they reflect the concept we're interested in. So I'm going to move on now to describing the measures that we've identified so far for each of the 4 impact areas. But first I want to reiterate that we view the collection of measures presented today as a starting point. A central purpose of this webinar is to solicit feedback from you in the field on the measures and how they can be improved upon. So in each of the next 4 slides, you'll see a table giving some of the basic information about the indicators we've identified. As you see here, the leftmost column of the table will give a description of the indicator. The next column gives the source of the data for that indicator. And the right-hand column gives the level of geographic analysis at which the data source is available. So our first set of measures presented here refers to the impact of creative placemaking on artists and arts communities. So far we've identified 3 measures that are designed to capture this concept. First, we have a measure of median earnings of residents employed in entertainment-related industries. This data, just to highlight what I described a moment ago about how the table is set up, it comes from a Census Bureau survey called the American Community Survey. And the sample size is large enough that we can get statistically reliable measures at the level of the census tract. To give you a sense of what this means, there are approximately 170,000 census tracts in the United States. So this is a fairly precise geographic unit of analysis. The next 2 indicators, number of employees at arts organizations and the payroll at arts organizations, both come from another census source, this time the county business patterns data. Now, before moving on to the next set of indicators, I want to take a moment to highlight a couple points about these as a way of illustrating the emphasis we want to put in this indicator system on transparency, and in this case, the importance of clearly articulating the strengths and weaknesses of different indicators. The first indicator in this list, median earnings, is based on interviews with individuals. Because of that, the indicator is an excellent way to capture data at a precise level of geographic analysis, precise data at a small level of geographic analysis, the census tract, and to capture information about self-employed individuals. Now, because we're interested in the arts, that's a particularly important group to track. However, the source does have a weakness. You'll note that the indicator gives a measure of people employed in entertainment-related industries. This means the indicator will include occupations that are not as closely aligned with creative placemaking goals, such as sports announcers, news reporters, public relations specialists. In comparison, the latter 2 indicators are based on data collected from businesses. These have the advantage of more accurately focusing on occupations associated with creative placemaking and with the arts, but they do have 2 weaknesses. First, these sources do not allow us to provide data at a lower level than the zip code. And second, because the data are collected from businesses rather than individuals, these measures systematically undercount self-employed individuals and other kinds of contract workers. And of course, that's a category into which many artists fall. I highlight the strengths and weaknesses of these particular indicators to illustrate the importance we intend to place on transparency in this indicator system. We'll make every effort to be as clear as possible about the theoretical underpinning, the data source, the method of calculating, and as I've highlighted here, the strengths and weaknesses of every indicator. The other indicators I'll present also have strengths and weaknesses, though I'll not get into this level of detail in highlighting them. I'd also like to note that while every indicator will have weaknesses, we're hopeful that through the input we receive from all of you, we'll find options that can help us overcome some of these kinds of issues. Moving on to the second set of indicators, which are focused on what we call attachment to community in the geographic area in which creative placemaking takes place. So far, we've identified 3 measures that are designed to capture this concept. The first, length of residence, gives us the average length of time those in a given geographic area have lived there. This is an indicator of community attachment widely used in research on neighborhood attachment. The share of housing units that are owner-occupied is also often used as a measure of neighborhood stability and residents' attachment to community. We include it here, though it's worth noting that increasing levels of owner occupancy over time can indicate gentrification and replacement of long-term residents. This may be especially true where multifamily housing stock is being converted from rental to condominiums or co-ops. Finally, we use a measure of the share of housing units occupied as a reflection of attachment to community. Our next concept, quality of life, is notoriously difficult to define. Keeping in mind that the goal of this indicator system is to focus on measures that the NEA thinks could be affected by creative placemaking, we focus on two general categories of measures that can be grouped under the rubric of quality of life: access to jobs and amenities to and neighborhood conditions. So for the concept of access to jobs and amenities, mean commute time to work is based on the idea that long commutes tend to be associated with a lower quality of life and may be indicative of a lack of nearby job opportunities. Second measure, which gives an estimate of the number of businesses in a neighborhood, is based on the idea that retail businesses tend to create street-level activity that's an initial signal of changes in the quality of life in a community. This measure can therefore help capture the initial appearance of new life in a community. The three measures we use to help describe neighborhood conditions, the first being crime. Crime statistics are one meaningful reflection of neighborhood conditions, especially when tracked over time and used in conjunction with some of the other indicators in this system. That said, any interpretation of changes in crime statistics should address the possibility that reports of crime in a neighborhood would increase as residents begin to feel more attached and thus more apt to report crime occurring in that community. The post office tracks addresses that have been more or less abandoned or are under construction and not yet ready to be occupied. When tracked over time, this measure can help reveal the changing conditions of a neighborhood. And finally, anchor institutions such as places of worship and community centers and social service agencies can reflect the extent to which conditions in an area are likely to endure. Our last indicators are designed to reflect local economic conditions. We use four measures to capture this concept. Property values are used to measure the desirability of the property itself, as well as the stability of a community over time. As people are commonly attracted to living near cultural resources, there tends to be a positive correlation between property values and conditions in a community as a whole. We intend to use median income as a measure of economic well-being among people living in a place, but it may also help to frame the owner occupancy measures described earlier, and thus giving us a little better handle on displacement and gentrification, which are important issues for us to be conscious of. Total number of jobs in an area is one measure of the size of the area's overall economy, as is the number of in-service business addresses, which we think captures a related dimension of that concept. So as I mentioned earlier, we're still collecting feedback on the indicators and how they fit into conceptual categories of the outcomes in which we're interested. I want to say a few words about where we see this process going. The balance we're looking to strike in designing the indicator system is between making the data widely accessible and easy to use on the one hand, and providing appropriate guidance and caveats as to how to use the data on the other. In part, as I've already emphasized, this means ensuring we provide enough theoretical background and description of the strengths and weaknesses of each indicator. We've also decided to avoid the temptation to simplify to the point that the measures are reduced to a single index or a single number. And although we haven't yet settled on the specifics of how the data will be presented, we certainly intend to include benchmarking and baseline information that will help users put what they see in perspective. In addition, we plan to explore a variety of methods for visualizing the data. The two maps shown here are taken from Policy Map on the left and from a product of the Open Indicators Consortium called Weave on the right. Either or both of these resources may be a good way to allow the public to visually analyze the data from the indicator study. We're also exploring other options, and of course we're eager to hear suggestions from all of you as to how best to make it possible to visualize the information contained in the indicators. Finally, I'd like to conclude with a couple additional comments about next steps. The project, as I said, is about improving our ability to understand and talk with one another and with policymakers at all levels about what happens in communities in which creative placemaking occurs. It's about connecting these indicators to the arts. And it's because of this effort that we're so eager to hear feedback from the field and from those of you who are embedded in that work on how to improve what we've presented today. No indicator system can be used in isolation, and none is without its problems, but we're eager to devise a system that can play a real useful role in communities around the country. So in the coming months, we're going to issue a solicitation for proposals that implement the next phases of this project. In this RFP, we're going to be seeking input on 3 key tasks, the first being to collect and annotate and organize the data from existing national level data sets for each of the indicators that we ultimately decide to include in the system. Next, we're going to design the functional and technical requirements for the web-based interface to make these data available. And lastly, we want to create a menu of other data sources, in this case both qualitative and quantitative, that reside at local levels and that have been used successfully by communities to monitor trends locally. These are the kinds of things that they don't meet our criteria of being comprehensive and comparable across localities, but we think they can add a lot of value, and so we want to be able to show that others have used them and provide a vehicle for people to explore options that may work in their own communities. So that concludes my prepared comments. I'm going to turn this over to Jamie in a minute. The remainder of the hour is reserved for Q&A. So I'll turn it over to you, Jamie. Thanks very much.
Great, Steve. Thanks a lot. We're going to open up the question and answer box, so feel free to begin typing in questions or comments, and we'll go to them. But before we do that, Steve, I just want to ask you to speak just a little bit more about one of those final points you made, which was that we really are looking for feedback, right? This isn't a baked system that you have done that you're just sort of showing off to the community. You're actually open to making some changes, to adding indicators, to taking something out, to making some changes. So we really are interested in having that level of feedback. Is that fair?
That's right, Jamie. Before we dive into the design of the remainder of the system, we really wanted to make sure that we'd done everything we could to get something that we are comfortable with, and real importantly, that's going to be useful out in the field. So you're absolutely right in emphasizing that. It's the key purpose of this webinar. And I hope we get some feedback, and you can, the email address I put on the last slide there is the place you can send it to. So
that's great. So essentially, just to sort of repeat back some of what you said, your goal as the sort of researcher and analyst coming into this was to sort of take a look at a bunch of creative placemaking projects and try and figure out what they collectively were trying to do. What happens when a community takes the arts and uses the arts to shape their social, physical, and economic characters? And essentially you came up with, and the team came up with, the notion that there are essentially 4 ways that impacts happen, right? There are impacts on artists and the arts community, there's an impact on community attachment, there's an impact on quality of life, and there's an impact on local economies. So we're looking for some sort of nationally collected data that would serve as indicators to say what's happening in those 4 areas. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are things getting the same? So one of the things that you and I have talked about in sort of earlier meetings is, for instance, that topic of artists in the arts community. At the moment, the 3 indicators that we're proposing all have to do with arts organizations. And one of the things that leaves out are artists and self-employed arts workers, which is a huge part of the community. And you sort of talked me through some of the reasons that this might actually serve as a proxy, as an indicator for that. So will you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. The key idea that we have here is that none of these indicators are going to do a perfect job of reflecting the overall concepts that we're interested in, especially taken by themselves. And so what we're hoping is that it's a collection of pieces of information that will give us a reflection of the outcomes that we're interested in learning about. Now, in the case you mentioned, I highlighted the example of the strengths and weaknesses of the median income figures compared to the figures from the county business patterns data. And ultimately, even though it is only the median income data that collects information on self-employed artists, we hope that the county business patterns data will also help shed light on what's happening with artists in a community. So even if it isn't, strictly speaking, collecting information about self-employed people, if it is collecting information about businesses and about the level of business activity, we think it's not unreasonable to expect that there's going to be an impact on individual artists that reflects. And so it's, again, they're all imperfect, but I think that they do all taken together help shed light on the topic we're interested in.
Great. Let's dive into some of the questions that have come in from the audience. There are two that I think sort of go together. One of the people who's listening in has sort of asked what you're going to use as a baseline year, and another person has asked what data our community is going to be expected to collect. So I'm wondering if you can sort of go back and just talk for a minute about what, in terms of the data that we're going to be collecting, what is our hope in terms of the time period that it will cover, and then also what's being collected nationally and what are we asking local communities to collect?
Well, I'll take the second question first, Jamie, because one of the things that was a key criteria for whether we're going to include it in this indicator system is that we don't want to create new data collection mandates. This is not about trying to NEA trying to make communities collect additional data. So in that sense, we're not asking communities to collect additional data. What we're going to be doing is relying on sources that are already out there, sources that are already being collected. And I think that ties into your second question, or your first question, I guess, which is what is the baseline for this? Now, the answer is it will vary by indicator. And what we intend to do is go back as far as there are data available. So to give you an example, the American Community Survey data, the first version of that survey was collected in 2005. So we'll be able to go back that far to get at least some of that data. But other data sources go back much further, and where that's possible, we'll collect it going back as far as we can. So in each case, for each individual indicator, the baseline may be different, and so it'll vary from one indicator and one concept to another.
Great. So essentially, our sort of fantasy for this project, when it's fully realized, is that there will be a set of indicators available to the public on a website, and you'll essentially be able to indicate time parameters and geography parameters. And you can sort of see what happened to these indicators over that time period in that geography. So theoretically, even if I didn't get funded by the NEA for a project, but I thought my project fit this sort of mold of creative placemaking, I could still go in and say, I'm the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and I want to know what happened in downtown Brooklyn over this period of time. Did you see some sort of impact? Is that the kind of thing that we're aiming for?
Absolutely. This is getting at the idea of the comprehensiveness and comparability across areas. So anywhere, in the example you gave, from Brooklyn to other parts of the country, where maybe the idea is that they're trying to create the opportunity for some creative placemaking. We want to be able to allow those communities to see and to compare, both looking back against a baseline and against other benchmarks, against other communities, against other parts of the country, to see what their indicators look like compared to these other possibilities. So that's absolutely right. And so it's not at all restricted to the places where Our Town is taking place. It's rooted in the Our Town projects, and we expect it to be particularly useful in those contexts.
Great. Now, it's going to get a little tougher for you at the moment because we have some great research colleagues who are listening in, Ann Markison and Jennifer Novak and others. And not surprisingly, they have the sort of standard social science questions about correlation versus causality. And are you going to, in some way, be able through this project to sort of prove that arts had a direct impact on causing the crime rate to go down? Or what are we, can you talk a little bit about causality and correlation?
Absolutely. So that's one of the issues that we've had to be very conscious of in this. And a lot of the language I've used today has been very, very carefully chosen to avoid suggesting that we're trying to design a way to specifically address the causal relationship between creative placemaking and the outcomes we're interested in. It's absolutely the case that we think this is a tool that researchers, whether at the NEA or elsewhere, could use down the line to help them conduct the research that would investigate that. But our purpose is more to begin the process of spelling out the indicators that we think capture concepts that we think are likely related to creative placemaking. And of course, we're not collecting concepts, we're not collecting data on all the other things that could affect those kinds of outcomes. And that is going to be an important part of a future research agenda that really attempts to nail down the causal relationships that you're talking about.
Great. And again, I mean, one of the things that our chairman, Rocco Landesman, has talked a lot about is that this work really sort of begins to weave, creative placemaking work rather, begins to weave together sort of the arts community and the broader community, and sort of often has them working together for goals. So Anne's question about, might there be other things going on in this community that could be contributing to it? Our answer is likely to be absolutely. Hopefully the arts are one of many strategies that are sort of moving things forward. One of the questions that was asked was one of the other things that you and I talked a little bit about, and this was the difference in urban, suburban, and rural communities versus home ownership versus rental markets. And so someone said, why isn't the sort of rental market up there as an indicator? And you talked through how that owner occupancy and some of those other occupancy rates would sort of play out. So will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that we that I haven't gotten into detail about in this presentation, but it's certainly going to be part of the ultimate indicator system as a whole, is what we've been talking about as framing indicators. Now, these are things that are measures of other that are separate from the ones that we've identified in the presentation so far, that are designed to help us shed light on the example on the kind of situation that you've just described. So, for example, owner occupancy in a rural area, high levels of owner occupancy in a rural area might mean something quite different from high levels of owner occupancy in a dense urban area. And so one of the things we want to do is use what I've described as framing indicators to help, in some sense, benchmark the indicator like owner occupancy, so that we're comparing apples to apples. We're not strictly comparing owner occupancy in a rural area to owner occupancy in an urban area, but rather looking at changes across time in each of those areas, and providing the ability for rural areas or urban areas to look at their counterparts and see how their indicators reflect what's going on in their community relative to others that are like them.
Great. I noticed that we have a number of Our Town grantees that are listening in, and some of them, all of the Our Town grantees rather, sat through a presentation earlier on that sort of talked about our original vision for this project, and that shifted a little. Our thinking has changed. We've gotten some feedback. So will you just talk a little bit about this project through the lens specifically of what an Our Town grantee might be interested to hear, such as, are you expecting us to collect local information? Are there things, should we be developing our own indicators? How should we be thinking about things like that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Jamie. And what ended up happening is that we went through the first round, or the first phase of the Our Town Indicator study, and came up with a list of indicators and the beginnings of an indicator system that is largely reflected in what you see here. And with some variation, it's very similar to what you see here. And that was the first phase of the study that the Our Town grantees are familiar with. Now, there were a variety of other phases that were scheduled to occur later on down the line, and they did include data collection at the local level. What ended up happening is that we realized after this phase that it was more appropriate to move in a slightly different direction, shift the emphasis away from collecting data at the local level and instead toward this national level focus and comparability and comprehensiveness across communities. So that's what's happened. We don't have at this point any plans to collect local data from the Our Town grantees. So that's a notable change from the earlier plans that they are familiar with.
Great. Also, just for the grantees to know, we do have two of our colleagues from the design office here, Jason Schubach and Jen Hughes. And if anyone has specific questions, feel free to use the Our Town email address, which is ot@arts.gov. So if you're a grantee and you have some specific questions, feel free to follow up directly there. If you have comments about the project overall, use Steve's email address, which is up on your screen. I know that some of you may not be able to see the questions that are coming in and scrolling through, but just know that we're able to see them all. So do please keep typing them in so we can keep talking. Steve, another question that's come up has to do with sort of the time frame over which we think a creative placemaking project might have an impact. And Alan Brown is asking about sort of short-term versus long-term outcomes for these projects. The indicators that you've laid out in the sort of 4 buckets of arts, local economy, quality of life, and attachment to community, are those short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, medium? We talk a little bit about duration.
Well, in some sense, that's an empirical question, right? I mean, we can imagine that those outcomes would occur in the short term, and it remains to be seen what happens in a given community over time. Now, the intent in selecting the indicators that we did is really more of a focus on the longer term kinds of outcomes. Just to take one example, the median time or the owner occupancy rates. Those aren't likely to change in a way that reflects the impact of creative placemaking kinds of activities over the real short term. They may change over the longer term due to creative placemaking, and as we've already talked about, due to a lot of other factors. But we are focused primarily on longer term kinds of outcomes for this system. That's the focus.
Let's go back and talk for a minute about some of the specific indicators that you're proposing to collect. Tim Wojin has an interesting thought, which is one of the things that many people think is an aspect of creative placemaking is that it increases the level of social interaction. There are lots of folks who sort of talk about the arts as a social activity, increasing empathy, increasing community attachment, and all of that. So he's wondering if we've given any thought to measuring the mode of commuting. So not just commute length, but is someone sitting by themselves in an automobile, or are they actually interacting with other people on a train or a bus or some other thing? Have you given any thought to mode of commuting as an indicator?
That's great. We've got our first official suggestion. I think that's fantastic. It's not one of the options that we've specifically considered, but there's a lot of sense in what he's saying, and it also strikes me that could be that could help us think about the commute measure that we did talk about, which was mean commute time to work. It may be that the mode of commuting is something that could help us reflect on what the mean commute time means. Now, that said, we have to. I don't off the top of my head know the source for such a proxy, so we'd have to zero in on whether it's something that meets the criteria that we've talked about being available and reasonably cost efficient and not requiring an additional data collection mandate on our part. So, but I really applaud the suggestion and thank you for it, Tim.
Yeah, and that's a great, and that's the sort of thing that we can follow up on really easily with our colleagues at HUD or the Department of Transportation who collect different kinds of indicators, different kinds of data on a regular basis and can follow up. One of the things you talked a little bit about in your presentation that's also one of the indicators that's of most interest to me is the notion of crime. And it's sort of counterintuitive in some ways to think that increasing arts activity might have any sort of impact on crime. Will you just unpack that one a little bit and sort of walk us through how you got to that as a potential indicator and what the hypothesis is about why there would be a connection between those?
That's not the first time I've heard a question about crime related to this topic, so I'm glad you brought it up. I think the best way to respond is to describe, sort of articulate again the steps that we get from the idea of a hypothesis about the relationship between creative placemaking and quality of life, And then the idea of thinking through the pretty difficult task of how are we going to measure quality of life. And of course, we're not the first ones to struggle through this kind of a challenge. And we don't think that crime in and of itself is the main indicator of anything in particular related to arts, but we think that crime does reflect the quality of life in a community. And if we want to see how quality of life changes in a community, then it's appropriate to be tracking what happens with respect to crime. So in some sense, we want to separate that particular question, the particular indicator, from the idea of a direct connection to the arts, and instead think about it in the conceptual way of crime as a reflection of this broader concept of quality of life.
And there, as one of the questions earlier indicated, there could be lots of things going on. So increased arts activity could mean increased people walking on the streets, and increased walking on the streets might mean that there's more public safety. And at the same time, though, some colleagues at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City were doing some work and said, they actually wonder if when you see increased foot traffic, you might see increased crimes of opportunity. So you might actually see an uptick in terms of shoplifting or pickpocketing, but you'd see a decrease in violent crimes. But, as you said, that could be going on for a lot of reasons. And because these are indicators, we're looking for things that say things are generally getting better and, quality of life is generally improving.
That's right. And if I can make one other point on that, it's that I talked during the presentation about the importance of being transparent and the importance of providing an indicator system that is really well-grounded. And a big part of that is going to be to talk through or to present a discussion that talks through the kinds of issues that you're raising and makes clear that here is the theoretical justification for using this indicator and to reflect this concept. Here's the justification for believing that this concept can help us understand what's going on in a community as it relates to creative placemaking, and here are some of the reasons that it might be an indication of something else, or it might be an indication of it might miss something important that we really do care about. So.
We have another question that I think is coming from an Our Town grantee. So I just want to tease apart two different things for folks who are listening on the phone as grantees. This is a research project that sort of delves into what happens with creative placemaking overall. This is not a final descriptive report that we're expecting from a grantee. So someone said, what are the NEA's expectations about when an Our Town grantee might move any of these indicators, how much? And so for those folks who are listening with that sort of lens on, there are a number of things that you've agreed to do in terms of your grant agreement with the NEA that you're required to do, that you'll report on through a final descriptive report, and those are your requirements as a grantee. This is much more meant to be a sort of broader investigation into what's going on with creative placemaking. So from a research point of view, you as a researcher don't have expectations that grantee X will do Y within Z time frame. You're more curious to see sort of what's going on generally. Yes?
That's right. It's not at all the case that if crime does not change in your community, then somehow the terms of your grant agreement have not been met. No, what we're looking at here is, and I think actually the emphasis on comparability across the country hopefully makes that point as clear as possible, is that we're not exclusively interested in our town communities. We're interested in all the communities around the country on which we can collect this kind of information. And it's intended to be something that is a tool that can be used by any community that needs to help think about the kinds of things that might work for creative placemaking in their area.
Great. A couple questions that sort of have to do with other folks that are looking at measuring the impact of projects. And there's been a fair amount of press around the foundation collaboration called ArtPlace. And ArtPlace is doing a series of things, rolling out the ways that they're measuring vibrancy. My understanding from conversations with them is that they're really interested in taking a look at their project through this lens of vibrancy. Folks are curious about how this project intersects with those. Are you in conversation with other researchers? Is this meant to be a standalone project? Just talk a little bit about your colleagues who are doing similar measurements around similar projects.
Absolutely. First of all, we've definitely been in conversation with all of as many of the colleagues as we have on this, who are interested in understanding the impact of creative placemaking around the country, and so that includes a lot of work that's being done at local levels. And that information is tremendously informative. And as I highlighted at the end of the presentation, we want to include as much of that as possible as a sort of a menu or an informational piece in this indicator system that people can bring to bear on their own communities or go to for ideas for how to collect information in their own communities. So that's definitely an important part of what we intend to be the outcome here. So that's one piece of the answer to your question. The other piece is indicators and measurements that are trying to do something at a similar level, a broad scope that may be looking at things across the country. And those we are extremely interested in aligning what we do with them, and specifically with ArtPlace, we have been in conversation with ArtPlace to do the best that we can to align what we're presenting here and what we're going to be ultimately presenting through a website, to align it with what the ArtPlace measurement is about, and ensure that we're not stepping on each other's toes, in a sense, that what we're trying to reflect is an accurate capture of what the Our Town projects are focused on. So.
That's great. Yeah, and one of the great things about being the government is the stuff we do is all meant to be transparent and shared, and so we want to be sort of open sourcey about everything that we're doing, so folks can take a look, see what's useful, add to it, take away from it, do that sort of stuff. A couple folks have some questions about size of geography. So let me say what I think is true, and then you can correct me. As you were walking through all of the indicators that you're looking at, the rightmost column on your slides talked about the geography, the smallest possible geography at which that indicator could be tracked. And many of them went down to the census tract level. Some folks have said, there's an aspect of my project that, yes, it's happening within one census tract, but I really think it extends beyond that and bleeds out into the community. If something's collected at the census tract level, can you sort of aggregate several census blocks together and look at that indicator across a bunch of census blocks in order to see if it's happening more widely?
So our goal with the system is to make this as usable, as widely available as possible. So we hope that people will take what is the end product of this project and put it to use in the way that works for them. And so part of that in one of the visualization examples I showed was mapping. And so if we're able to do this the way we're talking about, then we should be in a situation where we can a community can go in and find a map of their own census tract and however many neighboring census tracts they're interested in, and see what's happening with respect to these data points in all of those places simultaneously and across time. So you can look at a particular place or a collection of places across time. The other piece I would say is, as far as aggregating statistics in the sense of coming up with an average of some kind or another. Our intent in terms of transparency is to be as clear as possible about what can be done in a valid sense with those kinds of numbers and what can't. So providing the appropriate sort of description of how numbers are calculated, what can be combined in a legitimate way, and what would be a step too far in terms of combining numbers from different places or different times and things like that.
Someone else has mentioned, and I should have thrown this in before, that our colleagues at Americans for the Arts have been doing some really great work with the local arts index. And just want to say, yes, absolutely, Randy Cohen's another fabulous colleague with whom we're in a lot of contact about sharing what we're doing. And understanding what they're doing. So they're another one, just like the Art Place researchers and all of that. You'll be excited. We have a couple more suggestions for concrete things to think about. Someone's talked about measure of investment in terms of quality of life infrastructure. If the arts improve, if life is getting better, might we see cities and towns investing more in education, local transportation? Have you thought any about quality of life, non-arts quality of life infrastructure investments as a potential indicator?
So in the conversations we've had within the government outside of the arts community, that has been, those kinds of things have been a real important part of what we find other agencies are working on. And they're absolutely an essential dimension of quality of life. We've made a conscious choice in what we presented here that the focus of the activities is on things that are related to that we think are likely to be related to the arts and to creative placemaking activities. So we have had conversations actually about, just as an example, about the access to public transportation, and where we are right now. And of course, that's why we're seeking feedback. So I do welcome the suggestions. Where we are right now with that particular case is that we think it is an absolute reflection of quality of life, but not the part that is as connected to the artistic undertakings that we're interested in. So.
Well, I will throw in anecdotally, because I get to be the non-researcher in this conversation, that time and again I've seen that mayors who invest in the arts tend to also invest in the communities more holistically. So again, this gets to that sort of causality correlation stuff, chicken and egg sort of thing. Jeff Parks, a colleague, has sort of talked a little bit about the notion of the creative class. And that one of the things that happens when you start sort of amassing the arts together is people who like the arts tend to come and live in that area as well. And so he asked about education attainment levels for adults over the age of 26. Have you given a thought at all to incorporating some sort of indication around educational attainment?
You know, I'm glad someone has raised that, because it's another one that it isn't the first time that it's been a topic of conversation, and we've batted it back and forth, and I think some version of something that reflects educational attainment in a community is likely to become part of the finished version of this, because I think it's a really important point. One of the things that we struggle with is thinking through how to interpret what that means, what education levels in a community mean, and that goes beyond even the question of whether educated people are moving there or the people who are living there are becoming better educated. But it's a really important part, and it is almost certain to be part of the finished product. So that's great feedback. I'm glad to hear someone has suggested that.
And one of the things that you touched on this a little in your presentation, but also comes into with that question, is the notion that often comes along with arts investment and arts development, which is the notion of gentrification, right? Every community has a certain churn rate. People come, people leave. That happens naturally. And there's a thought that often when the arts come in, it can cause a different kind of people to come into a place and had lived there before. Have you given any thought in the indicator system? Are we going to be able to capture anything around that, or changes in population, or the sort of questions that come on impact that we might need to unpack if we're looking at education attainment?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So the gentrification kinds of issues are one that it's a frequent topic of conversation around this project, and we've made a first cut at capturing that concept in some of the things I've I described in here, where I talked about thinking carefully about owner occupancy rates, and I think in the end, what this is going to mean is a thoughtful dialogue or a thoughtful discussion in the indicator system of how to interpret different indicators in conjunction with one another. None of these indicators is intended to be taken as a single reflection of the state of a community. And so a thoughtful discussion of what owner occupancy rates, for example, might mean in different contexts, and when given certain values on some of the other indicators, and furthermore, how to think about changes in some of those indicators. So it's absolutely going to be part of the conversation, and we are eager to hear ideas from everyone out there in the audience about how to make that happen, and how to make it as reflective of what's obviously an important concept as it can be.
Great. We're coming close to the end of our hour together, so I want to do a couple of things. One is just thank everyone for the feedback and questions they've been typing in. A couple of things we haven't touched on over the microphones, but we have taken note of, and they're included in our thinking. And, someone, for instance, suggested that we check out huduser.org, and our colleagues at Housing and Urban Development, their research folks, have very much been colleagues we've been in touch with. So checking out that resource specifically is really helpful. One other thing I wanted to touch on, and then I'll leave you with one question, is someone talked about the notion of twinning communities. How could we use the system to sort of take a look at communities that are doing similar work or facing similar challenges and pairing them up? And one of the things that I'll just say that we're looking to do broadly throughout our grant-making offices, not just within the creative placemaking work, is thinking through how can we create communities of practice? Is there a way to do sort of more harvesting of the grants? Is there a way to say, person X in community Y has a lot in common with person A in community B, and we should really make a connection between them? So I think looking at this indicators system as it grows, in terms of helping us with that, would be a really useful thing. So thank you very much for that suggestion. The last thing I'd love to just sort of, last question, and we'll leave folks with this, is will you just go back and review for a minute a little bit about the timeline for this project and the sort of RFP that you're putting out? What exactly are we going to be bidding out? When will that be released? Who's going to be eligible to bid on that? And then the big question, when can I expect to log on to ourtowncommunityindicators.gov and see a shiny new website?
Well, you had to finish with that question, didn't you, Jamie? But actually, before even addressing that question, I want to just highlight one other thing about the comment you made about the twinning communities, and that is we are hopeful that this approach, this concept we're talking about here, the fact that it provides a common language, a common set of indicators across space and across the country, is going to provide one tool to address that very issue, and of course it doesn't mitigate the need for doing important data collection and thoughtful analysis at the local level, but we think it can really be a valuable tool in providing that kind of common language. So now to get to the other question. Our intent is to have a solicitation for proposals out within a couple of months, and the key tasks that we're looking at for that involve actually going out and pulling together the data that we settle on as part of the system. And pulling that data together and putting it into a format that's usable so that when we do have a web-based interface, it'll be something that communities across the country can go to and find what they're looking for, and see the background and the, as I've tried to describe it, a thoughtful discussion of the indicators, see that on the website. And then we're gonna have to develop the actual what the interface will be, and actually develop the interface. So our expectation is that that's part of the proposal. And then the last part of the proposal, as I talked about, was trying to get input from the field and from reviewing what we are familiar with already about how people are doing this in their own communities and what kinds of things they're collecting in their own communities that provide useful insights at that level, in that geography, in that part of the country, about quality of life or about attachment to community or about these other things that we're interested in. So we want to learn about what all of you out there are doing and be able to share that with other communities that may be interested in trying such things themselves. So those are the key things we're focused on for the next steps. And as I said, within a couple of months we'll have the RFP out on the street. It'll be open for anyone who's interested to bid on it, and anyone who's qualified, and including more than one organization paired together if they think that they have strengths in different areas. So that's the plan. The million-dollar question is, when will this actually be out on the streets? And I'm hesitant to offer a guess about the answer to that question, Jamie. The web development process can be quite a long one. So we would hope this will be out there within the next year to year and a half. That would be, I think, a reasonable goal for something like this.
All right, fair enough. I want to thank you very much, Steve, for taking all this time today. Thank everyone for logging on. If you have thoughts and questions and things that come up as you're mulling this over, please feel free to email Steve directly at shewfelts@arts.gov. As we said, we'll have the archive of this webinar up on arts.gov under our podcast, webcast, and webinar tab within probably 48 hours to 3 days.